Hello everyone, I'm Annie Gibbins and you're listening to Memoirs of Successful Women, the podcast where you get to hear candid conversations with fascinating women from around the globe who share aspects of their business and life journey, how they measure their success and what they have learnt along the way. Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Memoirs of Successful Women. And today I'm delighted to be speaking with Fiona Sturrock, who's a grief specialist with a business called Seeds of Grief. So her website is www.seedsofgrief.com. And I haven't had anyone on my program before purely discussing grief and what it means to people and how they process grief. And so therefore, I'm really looking forward to welcoming you. Hi, Fiona.
Hello. Hello. I'm excited to have this conversation with you. It's one of my topics of passion.
I'm assuming so, since you have based your whole business on it. So tell me and the listeners, what do you do at Seeds of Grief? Why did you actually start this business, and sort of what sort of clients do you see come through?
Oh, 1,000,001 questions.
A lot of questions.
I know. Let me start with where the seed of this business came from. Is I've experienced a huge amount of grief in my life. Like I say, that grief has walked alongside me since the age of 15. Mm-hmm. So 15, 17 and 19 were my first bereavements. And as I went through those bereavements, I had nobody. I had no guides, no mentors. I was parceled back off to university to get on with life, having just lost my mother, my grandmother. And I struggled. I had nowhere to turn. I had nobody to talk to. I tried counsellors, but nothing really worked. I ended up suffering with 10 years of anxiety. And the reason was because I was carrying that grief inside me for 10 years because I had nowhere to go with it. I had no knowledge or anything. And so fast forward, life goes on and it sends me even more bereavements. And what I realised actually was that grief in itself is the healing pathway. Grief in its messiness, in its noisiness, in its tears, in its sadness, in its sweat, in its snot, in its magnificent mess is the healing pathway. And if you don't take that pathway, then the grief actually just stays inside your body. And one of the ways it manifested for me was I had anxiety attacks for 10 years. So you can see there's been a long journey with grief for me. And that's where my journey started. And that's what had me develop the Seeds of Grief. It's a 5-step process. And it's for people who proactively want to work through their grief. And it gives them 5 steps for how to move through grief, how to move from the pain or the denial, or, wherever you are on that spectrum, to actually have the healing and learn and grow from grief. And one of my favorite passions about this work is we are growing from grief. We're actually growing ourselves, and we're having it be something that is a positive, not a negative in our lives. And a lot of people associate grief with negativity, and it's not. It's a positive experience if you're willing to walk the seeds of grief.
Absolutely amazing. So we're going to go back to your business later then, because I want to stay on that journey. So you had, I've read on your bio that you've even had 10 bereavements. That's a lot of people to lose in your lifetime. And starting at that age of 15 when you lost your mum, to lose your mum and your grandma very close together, and then a variety of situations. I'm aware that, they're from health conditions, from suicide, from, just aging, variety of reasons that they passed. So besides the shock from that, did it affect you in a different way based on the types of loss that you suffered?
Yeah. I think the most shocking loss that I suffered and recently was 2 men in my life who both committed suicide. And that loss was really new to me because it's a very hard loss to view in a positive. because they were in so much pain to actually take their own lives.
Mm.
So that was a really difficult loss to kind of navigate. But again, I applied my seeds formula and my steps, and that really helped me. It really, really helped me. And that's when I kind of realized I had this turning point of, I know how to work through this. I know how to make sense of this. I know what my body needs. Because grief isn't just something that lives in our head, it lives in our heart and in our
Mm.
body.
Mm.
The body is the container for the grief. So we need to work with our body to help it to express the grief and to move
Yeah.
through it.
Yes, it's a very physical experience, and it can be at times that is extremely inconvenient. I'll say, So sometimes, and I know that when I lost my father to a brain tumor, you have this time of intense grief, and then you think you're doing okay, and then just when you're not expecting it, you could be in the middle of a meeting, or you could be driving past. I see certain trees that reminds me of him, or something, and it just hits you, and I know I'm thinking, oh, this is very inconvenient now. Like, I don't mind processing it, but it's kind of random the way it hits. And it also is very physical effect, that it can do, that incredible tiredness, or just crying for no reason, or, is a reason, but it feels like no reason, or at inappropriate sort of times, I suppose. It's an amazing journey to go through. How did it affect you? Does it affect people in different ways?
Yes, and so
Yes.
every single loss is unique to you. So
Right.
you may have a bereavement, or you may be divorced, or you may have been made redundant for a company you've worked with for 25 years. You will experience loss and grief through those divorce, bereavements, or redundancy, and that is unique to you. However, I'm saying that 5 steps that you need to go through are everybody's human skills can go through them. Like, it's just a natural human process. Your body knows how to grieve. So
Mm,
when you talked about your father dying, you
mm,
talked about the heaviness that you felt in
mm,
your body, and you
mm,
talked about the tears that just came unexpectedly.
mm,
And the heaviness in your body is your body saying, hey, I'm carrying emotions here.
mm.
Hey, I'm carrying sadness, I'm carrying anger, I'm carrying tears, and it's weighing me down. And it's your body kind of reminding you that actually you need to let go of that. You need to express it. And if we don't make time and space to express the grief,
Mm.
um, then it will just pop out unexpectedly, like when you see a tree, like you
Yes,
experience driving the car, and the tears come,
yeah,
or you're in a meeting and you well up, and then most of us just swallow it back down. And
yes.
guess what? That's what we're doing. We're pushing it back into our system. We're not giving it the space to come out. So
Mm.
one of the steps of my process is that you actually give yourself space to grieve. So if you just stepped out of a 25-year marriage, you're not going to be over that in a month or 2 months or 3 months. That's going to take at least 12 months.
Mm.
And most bereavements take a minimum of 12 months. And if we look at the Aboriginal and we look at the African cultures, they have a grief ceremony when somebody passes, and a year later they have another grief ceremony.
Yes, yes.
And we've lost that in the Western world.
Yeah.
And so my seeds journey takes you through month 1 to month 12, and we will have time and space for you to express your grief, because the actual steps of grief, the tears, which your body tells you need to cry,
Yes.
the anger, which you feel, or the knot in your tummy, which you carry, or the heaviness in your cells, those belong to what's called being a human being, or the heartbreak.
Yeah.
Your heart breaking open. We all have that. We all have that. So whilst
Why do you think we don't do it well in Western culture? We definitely don't do grief well at all. I don't
yeah,
think we try to bury it, move on quickly. People, even not even ourselves, other people go, "Oh, aren't you over that yet? I thought you'd be better by now. Or you've cried a lot now. Now's the time to cheer up." And those sorts of comments. Why don't you think we do it well?
it's such a great question. Um, and part of it is because we're so obsessed with the positive. Everything has to be smiley. Everything has to be great. How are you? Oh, I'm great. I'm fine. There's a real emphasis on moving forward. you were over that. Exactly the comments you made, because people can't be with the sadness and the grief because it's being squashed out of our society. It's really being squashed out. There's no room for it because we're taught that the good emotions are joy, laughter, happiness, and we're taught that bad emotions are sadness, tears, anger, and rage. And actually, all they are is emotions, neither good nor bad. They just belong to what it is to be a human being, you know, and they live in all of us. So it's about us having the freedom to express all of it. Sorry, I was talking to a Hindu man who lives in India, where they have long grief rituals until recently. And the whole, as India has erupted and become far more of an economic power and people are working, then the grief rituals have been reduced in size from like 21 days to 4 days, because the priority is making money, the priority is working, the priority is avoiding.
Yeah. And that's definitely going to come back to bite them, because it's not a good thing to rush it, as you said.
Yeah.
It's interesting that we go from, a few days, a day off for a funeral or a few days compassionate leave, to then other cultures who, that's right, they'll wear black or a certain color for a year so that everybody knows, be really kind and be extra caring and be very sensitive, because we're assuming, they're not that great. They're not that positive at the moment because they are actually processing a real loss, so there's such a vast contrast. I think it's absolutely amazing. How do you wish people had approached you at age 15? I know that my children, for example, I had a really sad situation that when my twins were the first week in high school, and 5 days after they'd started, one of the boys that they'd gone through primary school was hit by a car and killed. And it was just so devastating for them, age 12, to have this loss. And then they were also very angry because other people in their new high school didn't know him. He'd only been there 5 days. So that, this really bizarre situation when you're grieving a lot and then other people don't appreciate how bad it would be. And then how do you actually even reach out to a child of 10, 12, or as you were 15?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I'm going to answer that because my son went through a bereavement when he was age 12 as well. The bereavement of an aunt who was very close to him, and so one of the things is to normalize everything, to normalize that you're going to feel sad, to normalize that you're going to have tears, to normalize it's okay to feel angry. Like I imagine your twins felt quite angry that the people in the school didn't recognize that this child and didn't value it. So that anger is normal and it's healthy. And actually, we want that anger. We want it to be expressed. We don't want it to be expressed in a way of kind of having a pop at somebody, but we want it to be expressed in a healthy way. Like, come on, punch a pillow, punch a pillow, go out and do some kickboxing to express that anger. So really to normalize those emotions in children and to give them places to express. So punching a pillow, if you're angry, or going and doing some kickboxing, or my son, he stood up and did a eulogy at his aunt's funeral, and up until that point I hadn't actually seen him cry and I hadn't actually seen him shed much emotion. And when he stood up to do his eulogy, he got through the first 2 sentences and then broke down. And when boys or men cry, the sob comes from so deep, so in their soul, that it stops the world. Because when a man cries, it just stops the world. And I just sat in the audience and I let him sob publicly in front of the whole people at the funeral. And I could hear people going, Fiona, Fiona, shh, Fiona, Fiona, shh. And I just sat there and just let him sob because he needed that. That was his first breakthrough of raw emotion, of grief to come through. And what was beautiful about it was held by all the people in that congregation, all the people at the funeral actually held him in their hearts and witnessed him. And that's such an important part of grief, is to be witnessed and to be held. And so that's what we want to do, is we want to create an environment where everybody feels witnessed and held. He, at some point, he stopped crying and he just looked at me. And then I got up and then I went and stood behind him. I didn't say a word to him. I just put my arms around him and I stood there. And he looked at the audience and then he went back to doing his eulogy.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. So you'd given him that sense of support. I'm here, but
Yeah.
it's okay. Go on as you are.
Yeah, exactly. It's okay to cry, and it's okay to cry in front of all of these people, and it's okay to be the voice of their tears as well. Because he was just really sharing the heartbreak that was in the room for his aunt's loss. So it's really about giving space. And nobody did that to me when I was 15 or 17 or 19. I wasn't given that space or support. I was sent back to university or back to school to move on with life. And it's really important to give that space to people and to listen to them and witness them. The metaphor I have is like your heart holds somebody else's heart. That's all you've got to do, have two hearts that hold each other. And that in itself is so healing.
When you were sent back to school, sent back to university, how did you feel? What were your emotions? Were you surprised, or did you think that was normal because the people who were your guardians were telling you to do that? Did it feel odd? Did it feel strange?
I didn't know what to feel. I was in shock. It was 10 days after my mum had died. We'd just had the funeral, and then I was put on the train back to university because my dad thought the best thing to do was move on with life. And I was just in shock. I was absolutely, which is for the first 3 months after a bereavement or after a divorce or after a redundancy, you are in shock. The body is in shock. The body doesn't, it's the body almost, you've got a little person sat behind your eyes just watching this movie of life that you're in, right? You're not actually there. And so that's what I was watching this movie of this life that I was living, but I wasn't present because I was in such shock. And that's very normal for the first 3 months of grief.
Yeah.
Normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because
So,
you just don't have those skills or that experience. You haven't been through it before. You know, your body is just total overwhelm, isn't it? You know, it's just shut down, and it's almost like, well, I can't even feel. You know, that's when you can't even cry. When people say they haven't cried yet, it's kind of like going, well, they actually haven't even processed the shock yet to be able to then get to that stage where they cry, and then that's, you know, whenever. You know, I think that's an interesting point too, that this rush to get on, or maybe if we put you in a different place you won't feel the same thing. You know, that's a sort of strange way of behaving as well. It's kind of like, well, if I send you from here to there and someone else looks after, or if you suddenly get busy, then the grief won't hit you as hard, or it will go away. But that's it obviously follows you everywhere, because grief is grief. You know, it is your response. And, you know, does it help in any way having that separation, or is it actually better to just confront and be immersed in it?
Yeah, it's better to stay with the grief because you're carrying it inside your body, right? It's in your cells, it's in your heart, it's in your tummy. You know, you're carrying it. And those first 3 months, it's perfectly okay to numb out and watch TV or watch films. You know, like I remember when my first friend committed suicide. For 4 days, I just sat and watched box sets because I just couldn't compute it. And my body was in so much shock that it just needed the distraction. So that's like a normal process. But by 3 to 6 months, you want to be starting to actively look at the grief that you're carrying, to actively start to work with it, to start to engage with the emotions. Because by the month 3, there should be a shift. The body starts to melt and starts to come out of the shock. So there is for me, there is a timeline of grief which is very different to what many people say. Many people say, oh, grief can hit you anytime. It can hit you 10 years later, 5 years later, 2 years later. It can, unless you're proactively going through a journey. And if you're proactively going through a journey, if you're saying to yourself, right, I'm going to actually give myself a year to grieve my marriage, and I'm going to proactively go through that year, then that's going to support you through and out the other side of grief, as opposed to it hitting you in a year's time or 10 years' time. You've
Incredible.
avoided it, or you've boxed it, or you've filed it in the computer to come back to.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. You've mentioned a few times, which will surprise some listeners, we often think of grief automatically as someone has died. But you've
Mm.
referenced, a few times now of, someone, just a marriage fails or your career ends or, you suddenly have a fallout with your best friend since childhood days and things change. Does that sort of grief reaction, do people generally see that as grief, or are they surprised that that's grief?
They're totally surprised. So
Yes.
I've got 4 male clients at the moment, and um, they're all dealing with divorce situations, and I've had to say to all of them, one of them actually, he went to the doctors and said, "Oh, I've got pains in my heart. Is everything okay?" And the doctor did all the tests. He says, "Yeah, your cardio's fine. Everything's fine with your heart." And I said, "Yes, the pain in your heart is from your divorce. You're
Mm,
stepping out of a 20-year marriage. You've got 2 children, and your heart's hurting. Your heart is in pain.
yeah.
So that's really normal and really healthy." But once again, they just think, "Oh, I'll get over that. I'll move on with that.
Yes.
I've finished that." And it's like, no, you're going to take at least a year, at least a year to get over that. And
Mm.
even one of my clients, he'd moved on and he'd met somebody else. And yet, as I was working with him one to one, we did a year's worth grief work with him because I was the only person he could grieve with. He couldn't grieve with his new partner, couldn't grieve with his ex partner. So it was
Mm.
just me who he could work with.
What do you say to those people who medicate themselves through grief?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And I love the word that you said, medicate, because medicate can be medicine, but it can also be things like
Can also be alcohol, drugs,
absolutely, yeah,
anything
overeating.
to distract you. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. And I think you used the key word, a distraction or
Mm.
something to avoid or something
Mm.
to numb out. And so the first thing I would help them to do is identify. So I see with grief, you are either consciously engaging with grief, choosing to go through a grief journey, or you are unconsciously engaging with it. Because grief is going on in your body,
Mm.
whether you're consciously engaging with it or not.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense.
And some people who choose not to engage with it, they're drinking, they're smoking, they're medicating, they're doing a whole range of different things. They It's still happening to them. They're just ignoring it. They're just pushing it away. They're just
Yeah.
avoiding. And actually, what we need to do is look up what they're doing and say, okay, these are my strategies. This is what I'm doing. How do I need to change those behaviors? And they
Mm.
don't have to do it overnight. It's a
Mm.
gentle process, but it is about becoming conscious. Oh, I'm overeating. I'm over drinking. I'm partying too much. I'm this. Let's just be conscious around it.
Yeah. It's just looking into the behaviors you've got and why have you started those behaviors, and are they actually helping you or are they just prolonging,
Yeah.
they're a band-aid
And
treatment. Mm.
normally people are doing those behaviors because they've got nowhere to go. They
Yes,
don't
of course.
they've got nobody to talk to, they've got no system to come through, and that's again why I developed the Seeds of Grief, so that you have somewhere to go. You
Mm.
have a community around you. Because
Mm.
again, the Aboriginal, the African, the Hindu, they all do grief in community. You
Mm.
don't sit at home and grieve alone. Everything is done in community. So
Mm.
that's what the aim of the Seeds of Grief is to provide a community for people.
Mm.
You've
Mm.
got somewhere to come to where your heart is being held and you'll be heard and listened to.
Mm. Hmm. Interesting. What do you say to those people who I've had a few times in my life that someone's died, and someone will then buy them a cat or buy them a dog and say they're going to be lonely, they need company. They don't necessarily ask the person, do they want a cat or a dog, but they just go, oh, I want to give you something. I want to help you in this way. And so someone gives them a way of what they think will help them. Is
Yeah.
that a good idea or is it not a good idea?
Um, so cats and dogs bring a huge amount of comfort to people. And a huge amount of joy and a huge amount of love. So cats and dogs are just beautiful. However, the piece to be looking at is, are you actually stopping somebody's grief, or are you actually making space for it?
Mm.
So um, whether it's you give them a chocolate bar or a cat or a dog, or whether you send them back off to university like I was,
Mm.
that's all stopping the grief. It's not actually sitting down with them and saying, come on, let's cry.
Mm.
Let's get angry about the loss that you've just experienced, or the mother that you were cheated of having.
Mm.
It's all just trying to stop the pain, because we have an allergy to what we perceive pain to be. That, remember those negative emotions that we're all labeled? They're not negative, they're lovely. I mean, having a good cry can be one of the best things in the world. You feel,
Oh, absolutely. I love it.
yeah, it's such a
I love the
relief,
feeling
absolutely.
afterwards. It's really it's like, "Whoa, God, glad I've got all that energy." It's like a whole lot of energy release,
Yeah,
and besides the puppy eyes and all the other effects of it, but it still does make you feel really good. You sort of go, "Well, I must have needed it," and just
yeah.
sometimes it's a shame it takes so long. It's often, it's been coming for a long time, and it's just the one person who then suddenly looks at your eyes and go, "You're not really okay, are you?" And then you go, "No, I'm not actually." Um, wow. So as you journeyed
And
through
that,
life and sorry, I'll let you share there.
that's the same for anger as well. Like if you go to the gym and you do a good punch kickboxing or whatever, or you
Mm,
have a good scream, you feel the same relief. You
yeah.
seem, it's the same cathartic moment. It's the same thing, and it's a
Mm,
really important part to know that anger's part of grief. It's one of the phases that we need to, because people think that it's bad and wrong to be angry. It's not. It's a
mm,
legitimate feeling. You've been cheated, or you've been betrayed, or you've lost
mm.
somebody who you loved. You get to be angry about that.
You
And
should be angry about that, you know?
exactly.
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 If you're not angry, it's kinda like, well, why not? If
Yeah.
you're not crying at someone's funeral, well, almost like, why not? Should be a bit choked up. And coming back to that funeral bit, that's actually really quite interesting because I'm reflecting now. And so many times, I know my husband at his father's funeral, he was bawling his eyes out. And there's that same sort of feeling of, do you go there and be, sort of be the support person or not? And it's kind of like going, well, he's a mess. It's okay to be a mess. It's all right. He knew he was going to cry. You're expecting to cry, and that's it. You've got a eulogy through tears, and that's actually okay. Unless they actually can't speak and still did want to get their talk out, and then you can take over. There's a real sensitivity, but this, sort of don't cry sort of thing is actually, it is sad. It is sad that we try to do that and to avoid the, because it's our discomfort more than theirs. I think
Yeah.
when you're in that state, you're not really worrying about, well, what does this look like? Other people find it uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
which I think is an interesting thing to reflect on.
And mostly they're finding it uncomfortable because they haven't grieved their own grief. Because if
Mm,
once you've grieved your grief, you can sit next to somebody who's grieving and you can say, this is healthy, this is normal, absolutely let it all out. I want to hear more of it. But if
mm.
you haven't grieved your own grief, then you feel a bit like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Help.
Exactly, exactly. And it's like anything when it's not familiar. You suddenly, we avoid what's not familiar. It's out of our comfort zone, so therefore we want to just sort of stay there. But as you've said, yeah, that's right. It's going to be there anyway, whether you like it or not. Like so many other areas that affect our lives. So, how did this take you to become a grief specialist? What sort of training? Are there training courses? What does it involve to suddenly get into this area and start consulting and coaching people through this time?
So I think for me, when my mum died and I was 19, it actually changed the pathway of my life.
Mm,
So I was at university studying marketing, which I completed and finished. But there was a point where actually I realised this isn't for me.
mm,
There's more out there in this world, something more important than the latest ice cream brand or the latest, you know, widget cereal or something. And so I retrained to be a coach. And in retraining to be a coach and stepping into the development world, I have experienced so much around coaching work, training, which is about being with individuals in wherever they are, as you know, as a coach. I've done a lot of somatic body work training, which has given me an understanding of the importance of the body. Like the body is being seen now as the wisest part of us. For
mm,
years, we've thought it was just the head, and
yeah.
we're like, I think this, I think that, my head tells me this. And actually, it's the soma, it's the body, it's the heart, it's the gut, it's the actual physical cells that is really, really being seen as the new informant. So I've done a
Mm.
huge amount of body-based work. And then as I journeyed through my 10 bereavements, I did grief rituals. I studied under people who were grief specialists, so African grief specialists who brought over their grief rituals from their African villages to here. I researched Jewish traditions, Hindu traditions, Aboriginal traditions. So I've done a lot of personal, professional, and research around grief and what it takes, and what it means to walk the pathway of grief in a healthy way and a proactive way.
Mm.
Again, my passion is that grief is not a negative. Grief is not something bad or wrong. Grief is Mother Nature's, it's our body's way of healing us. And we just need to partner with our body, and our body will take us on a healing pathway.
Mm. So, for those people who are listening and haven't addressed their grief, describe how you think they might be feeling.
I'm hoping they're getting some aha moments in their head. It's like, oh, I do that, or oh, perhaps she's talking about me. So I'm hoping that that's part of what's coming across, and also this invitation just to really give yourself permission to allow grief to be part of your life,
Mm.
or however long it needs to be. So my mother's death, I did not grieve for 10 years.
Mm.
And during those 10 years, I had anxiety attacks. And what I realized through my research, my studies, and my education was that was my body going, knock, 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 knock. We've got emotions in here that need expressing. Knock, knock. We've got grief in here that needs expressing. And the only way my body had to talk to me was through anxiety.
Mm.
And so I grieved my mother's death very quickly. I went deeply into a emotional processing of releasing, like in a ritual, and it was grieved in sort of 30 minutes. And it was like a whole weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It's like these bags that I'd been carrying for all these years had just gone. I was flying after that. And that's just the invitation. That's the invitation to people. It's like when you give space to your grief,
Mm.
you can drop the weight, the heaviness that you talked about earlier. You can just release it.
Mm.
And as you release it, you come back to you, and you can then be in a relationship and look, wow, from my mother's death, here's what has come, here's what's evolved, here's where I've grown. I chose my career from my mother's death because she gave me the gift of realizing that life is more than just marketing. It's about, human hearts and human souls.
Mm. Mm.
That answer
Yeah,
your
I
question?
think, I was imagining someone sitting there listening to this going, yeah, I regularly still, even though something might have happened many months ago or even years ago, I still have these feelings that, that's right. I get stomach aches, or I get, crushing chest sometimes, and I know it's not heart problems. Or I have more overly reactive to certain situations, or it could be that you're just suddenly sitting there thinking, yeah, maybe it is grief. How do people suddenly reach out to you? How do they know, oh, I need to go and see a grief counselor or specialist rather than, a GP or a psychologist? Or, how would people know to find you?
Yeah. So I've got the Seeds of Grief community, which I'm running through Mighty Networks. And I've got the website where you can go and get put an email address in, and I'll send you an introduction to grief booklet for free. And then I've got my book, The Seeds of Grief, coming out next year as well. But what I really want people to do, and the description you gave was just so perfect, because quite often they think, oh, I've got something wrong with me, I need to go to a GP. And
Mm.
actually pause and stop. What's happened in your life a month ago, 2 months ago? What do you secretly know in your heart that's
Mm.
you've had that headache since, you've had that tummy ache since,
Mm.
and then allow that to be you coming into consciousness. Or I'm overeating, I'm drinking, I know I've done that since my parent died or since I got my divorce. I actually need to reorientate this because that's my body trying to numb out. So
Mm.
kind of have those awarenesses, which I hope we've both brought through, because you brought through a
Yes.
lot of them through our conversation, to just think, actually, no, I will walk forward. I will be proactive.
Mm.
I will commit to going on a journey with grief.
Mm. Mm.
It's a bit like going to the gym, right? You want to lose 10 pounds, you're going to go to the gym once a week to,
Yes,
you
exactly.
know,
It's giving yourself permission to actually be proactive about a choice. And so that's right. While you might do that to get fitter or to get coached or to, spend more time being mindful or whatever, then, this is actually another area. It's actually just saying, give yourself permission to, not be great all the time, to actually process those feelings, to process those emotions, to get in tune with what's actually happening with your body, and actually take time out, and I've discovered that, I was one of those people who always had to be fine, always had to be fine. It's almost like there's no opportunity because, particularly because I was a mum fairly young, and you're always looking after someone else. So you're sort of like, well, I don't have time to be able to fall apart. So you sort of just bury things. And it's not until, and that's where, like you've shared today, if you haven't had those times to reflect, it can come out in bizarre situations because it is all just sitting there at the surface, and it's often when you take your foot off the pedal just a wee little bit, like, you're on a holiday or something else, and sort of like your routine changes and things can then just surface, and you kind of like, it's almost like, what is going on with me? That's right. Why do I have anxiety and I'm actually on a holiday and I should be fine? Why, it's like things aren't quite right. And so, I mean, that's just my journey. It sort of happened in a weird way. And then I realized that I actually needed to, just process, find out, well, if it doesn't feel right, what is it, and find the source. And then ultimately, that's right, look after yourself and get, deal with it. And then that's right, the more we become in tune with our own bodies and our own emotions, then the better we'll ride through the rest of our lives, on this planet.
absolutely, we're like a whole human being. Every single cell has information for us. So
Yeah.
really tuning into that. Yeah,
Yeah.
really lovely.
Oh, terrific. Well, thank you for sharing your story with me today and the listeners. I think it's been really, really interesting. I must admit, I've never had a grief specialist on my program, or even met one before I met you, Fiona. So I think that it's just so niche and so interesting, but so necessary, and I know through my coaching of women, I've come across people, and I have one currently who has been deeply impacted by grief, and it is a huge burden that they just want to get over it. Why is it still bothering me? And so to have someone who has walked that through her own life, you've not only experienced it, unfortunately, but you've also processed it and studied and made it your whole life journey in that way to help other people through. I think what better person for people who need to be able to reach out to someone. I say go and contact Fiona, and I'll have all your details on my podcast platform. And so just give yourself permission, ladies, permission just to breathe, breathe and relax and reflect and just to be.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not a scary journey. It can be a very simple journey. It can just start with journaling, so it doesn't have to be a big, scary, what am I going to be asked to do? It's like, let's start gently. And you've done a lovely interview. Thank you so much. I really feel that you really brought it down to earth, to the ground, to everybody. So it's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, thanks so much.
Really lovely. And I hope your listeners have found something of use and some aha moments as well.
Oh, definitely. I'm very, very sure. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Memoirs of Successful Women. You can find me at anniegibbins.com, where you can download my free resources, get connected on social, and check out my online magic transformation program. If you love this show, feel free to subscribe to future episodes, and of course, share it with your friends. I'll see you again soon, and until then, happy podcasting.